Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome if you are watching tonight on Facebook or YouTube, and also welcome to those of you watching on GoToMeeting. If you would do us a little favor, just take a second and hit the like or share button. And if you're on YouTube, hit the subscribe button to follow us. If you do, you'll be able to get notifications about new episodes when they appear here on Warbird Tube TV. Well, as you watch tonight's presentation, I'm sure you're going to have some questions. Tonight's going to be a very interesting topic. Just type them in the comment section. We'll try to answer them at the end before we sign off. This is episode 80 of Warbird Tube, and tonight we take a look back at the raid on Ploesti, August 1st, 1943, Operation Tidal Wave. And joining us now is David Klaus, who has done a great deal of research on this famous raid. David, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate you inviting me, and I'm glad to be able to address all the folks out there in aviation land. This is an interesting story as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to be talking rather quickly because this is an information-dense presentation. I'll tell you what, the subject is so complex that not only am I going to be giving you the highlights, I'm pretty much only going to be giving you the top of the highlights because we don't have enough time to get into the details to really and truly understand everything that went on. That being said, I just want to acknowledge that today, the 3rd of August, is the 79th anniversary of the first mosquito reconnaissance flight over Ploesti to assess bomb damage. The raid, of course, was on the 1st of August, which 2 days ago was the 79th anniversary of the actual attack. The interesting thing I find is that the Axis completely failed to detect that mosquito on the 3rd of August, and they also did not detect the mosquitoes that flew back on the 19th of August or the 24th of October. So it's very interesting that their air defenses were so unaware, at least in that respect. 4 words changed my life in a very big way. General Ent lost it. In 1983, I was a aide to the commander of 15th Air Force, and I had the opportunity to meet a lot of very important people. I was certainly not important, but I got to meet a lot of important people, one of whom was General Leon Johnson, who earned the Medal of Honor at Ploesti. And I was honored to host him at my home twice during that year, between 1983 and 1985, and interviewed him both times. And when we got to the subject of Ploesti, the general looked at me and said, "Dave, do you want to know what really happened at Ploesti?" And I said, "No, sir." Well, of course I didn't say that. I said, "Yes, sir." And his next words are burned into my memory as if he had just said them to me 2 minutes ago. He said, "General Ent lost it." General Johnson was nice enough to endorse my copy of the Stuart and Dugan book on Ploesti, which is the seminal book written in 1962. There's things in that book that were not quite right, only because the information was not available to Stuart and Dugan at that point in time. But we'll talk about a little bit that as we go along here. So General Johnson set me on this path almost 4 decades ago. He told me what happened, and then he challenged me excuse me, to prove it. Oops, I think I just lost that. To prove it. So what I have done in those intervening years, between finishing up an Air Force career and several other careers in civilian life afterwards, is to look at contemporary records at the National Archives in the United States, in England, Romania, the Bundesarchiv in Germany, and many other places where I can find original documentation, because it's important, as far as I'm concerned, to look at contemporary records versus war stories and old memories from veterans talking about things that happened many decades ago. I also have tried to gather as many contemporary letters home from crewmen and diaries as possible. And from that, I think I've got a fairly good handle on the story that goes on, a story about what went on Ploesti. All right, so why? Okay, there we go. Will Rogers said, "It ain't what we don't know that gives us trouble. It's what we know that just ain't so." And that's part of what I'm going to be addressing here tonight, because there's a lot of myth that has arisen around the Ploesti mission on the 1st of August, 1943, the Operation Tidal Wave. And I'm going to try to correct or clarify much of that information here tonight. So I'm going to be talking about the Nazi and American perspectives, the defenses, the American planning, the execution, the aftermath, and then some takeaways or maybe even lessons learned, and then wrap it up. And then if we have time, and Steve will be the one who tells us the answer to that, I've got a couple of pretty cool 10-second film clips of airplanes. Okay, so here's a test question. Which color best represents the tidal wave attack? Is it the pink 9th Air Force airplane or the green 8th Air Force airplane? Hold that in your mind as we go through this presentation. Now, I'm going to cut to the chase here real quick in case you have to get off the line. Tidal Wave was a military operation to achieve a political goal. And that's very important. It's a political mission, obviously operated by the military. Also, it's important to understand, and I'm going to lay out the information here for you as we go along, that the 8th Air Force bomb groups were successful. The 9th Air Force bomb groups failed. And of course, the mission commander also failed. Again, we'll go through that as we pass through this presentation. And then finally, the mission was significantly more successful than has been generally reported. But I'm going to digress here real quick to talk about a couple of technical details of B-24s that flew the mission. First is the fact that the Norden bomb sites were removed from the airplanes because those were high altitude bomb sites and were replaced with what was called the N7 bomb site, which was a modified fighter airplane N6 gun site. And cameras were mounted on quite a few of the airplanes. It's really interesting. They had both motion picture cameras and still cameras that were either fixed in place or handheld cameras, typically by waist gunners shooting out the waist windows. A bunch of airplanes were shot down in Romania, and the film survived. The Romanians developed the film, and now that film has disappeared somewhere in the sands of time. So it would be wonderful to find that film that the Romanians recovered, but we can't do that. Speaking of film, in 1959, the federal government ran a silver reclamation product and destroyed millions and millions and millions of feet of film to recover about $14.77 worth of silver from that film. And that includes most of the original Tidal Wave combat motion picture film. Just boggles the mind. But anyway, that was what happened. Okay, also the ball turrets on the 389th Bomb Group, which had the newest airplanes, and then some of the replacement airplanes were also new, arrived in North Africa with ball turrets. This was a 2,400-mile round trip. And those ball turrets were not necessary for low-level attacks, so they were removed from the airplanes to save weight and then obviously to extend the range of the airplanes. Speaking of extending the range, the airplanes all had bomb bay fuel tanks added. These were not droppable tanks. Later on, there were droppable tanks that were designed, but these were actually fixed in the airplane, and to drop them, you had to unbolt a bunch of stuff and this, that, and the next thing. Most airplanes had two extra bomb bay fuel tanks, one in each of the two front bomb bays. The later airplanes, which had more wing fuel tank space, only had one in the front left bomb bay. But in the left-hand picture, you can see the bottom of one of the fuel tanks. And in the right-hand picture, you can see a couple of guys loading a 50 caliber ammo can on top of a fuel tank laying on its side. In the 8th Air Force, they put a couple of flexible 50 caliber guns in the nose of many of the 8th Air Force airplanes that went to Ploesti. This was an 8th Air Force only modification and was actually not specific to Tidal Wave. The design of this project started all the way back in January of 1943 as a way to combat head-on attacks by Luftwaffe fighters over Northern Europe. But it also turned out that they were pretty handy on Tidal Wave. In 9th Air Force, which did not have those twin flexible guns, some of the airplanes had twin fixed 50s mounted underneath the floorboards up in the nose. In the lower right-hand photograph, you can see the two muzzles sticking out. In the left-hand photograph, you can see one of the muzzles that's sticking out of Wongo. And then, of course, you can see the N7 bomb site, which it looks a lot like a gun site because it started off as a gun site before it was modified. So also, there's been discussions about a 10-cent gun sight, and it's been oftentimes conflated with the bomb sight and called a 10-cent bomb sight. It was not. It was a gun sight. You can see in the middle photograph there that it probably did cost 10 cents because it's just angle iron and a steel ring welded to the front of it so that the pilot could basically aim the nose of the airplane and shoot those fixed guns in the bottom of the nose. Some of the 9th Air Force airplanes also had twin 50 caliber waist guns mounted in place of the single waist gun that would be normal on a B-24. Many of the airplanes had it, certainly not all of them did. And as far as I can tell from my research, this was only a 9th Air Force modification. Now, let me show you a pretty cool film clip here that is in color. This is what the crews saw. This is en route This is approaching. This is the 98th Bomb Group approaching White 4, the Astro Romano refinery. You can see what the crews actually saw as they approached. And by the way, the airplane taking the pictures is way too high. We'll come back to that issue in a second. Okay, let's fix the place and time for this mission. Stalingrad had fallen 6 months earlier. The RAF dam buster raids on the dams in Germany was 6 weeks earlier. 1 week earlier, Mussolini was kicked out as the dictator of Italy. The Kursk tank battle, which is the largest tank battle in history, was well underway at that point in time, and the Germans were getting their butts kicked. The invasion of Sicily, which was Operation Husky, was well underway at this time. And by the way, I should point out that all of the bombers that participated in the tidal wave attack on Ploesti also participated in bombing to support the Sicily invasion, Operation Husky. We'll talk about that in a little bit greater detail a little bit later on. The RAF was in the process of firebombing Hamburg into a burned cinder. And 1 day after the tidal wave mission, on the 1st of August of 1943, John Kennedy's PT-109 was sunk in the New Georgia area on the 2nd of August. Okay, I want to talk a bit about the Nazi perspective and why all of this was important to them. Germany needed oil, and it's obvious that they need it for the armor and the motor transport, which primarily used low octane, aviation high octane, shipping and industrial, fuel and lubricants. And I want to particularly make sure that you're aware of that issue of lubricants. We're going to talk about that again in a little bit more. The Germans didn't have anywhere near enough fuel or lubricants available for a long war. And of course, as many of you will already know, Hitler expected to have a short war or a series of short wars and did not expect to have a long war. But be that as it may, they were way short on fuel and lubricants. Now, the Germans had invented synthetic fuel, and which was converted coal into basically gasoline and other types of fuel. And they had plants, but those plants were primarily within easy reach of Allied bombers. The plants were productive until the spring of 1944, when they started to get bombed out of existence. But it's important to recognize, and the Germans did recognize, that synthetic fuel was not going to meet their full requirements, so they had significant reliance on foreign crude oil refining, which is primarily Romania. Oil supplies, again, this is not going to come as a surprise to most of you listening. Oil supplies was a big part of German strategy. In 1941, they invaded the Balkans specifically to protect the oil supplies in Romania and in Hungary, but primarily Romania. And in 1942, the Soviet oil in the Caucasus was a major factor of the Soviet invasion. There were many more factors, but that was one of the major factors. Aviation gas was crucial throughout all of this. As you are well aware, it was needed for combat, and it was also needed for training. Excuse me. Training was seriously curtailed in 42 and ceased in September of 44. And think about that for just a second. If we're not training new pilots, that means we're using up our experienced pilots. We're basically grinding them into dust. And that's exactly what happened to the Germans, because they didn't have the fuel to fly, to train more fighter pilots, and frankly didn't have enough fuel as 1944 progressed to even conduct adequate operational sorties. So on a different level, the most serious fighting might have been on the ground, but a war economy supplies that fighting without fighters to defend the factories. A bad end is just going to come for sure. Now, I also need for you to understand that aviation gas was not the main product of Ploesti. It was a product, and they produced a lot of it, but it was not by any means the main product. The Americans, and I remember I told you that this was a political mission. Our main actors on the Allied side were Roosevelt and Churchill, but the man who really mattered was Uncle Joe Stalin. It's true that oil was a vital strategic target on its own, but it was well known to Allied intelligence that Romanian oil production was falling. It was already falling by the time of summer of 1943. So oil being a vital strategic target on its own did not necessarily mean that Ploesti had the importance in the summer of 1943 that it had, for example, in 1941 and 1942. Also, we need to recognize that Roosevelt had a deep affinity for Stalin. And as a matter of fact, most of you will be aware that Roosevelt's very first foreign policy action that he took in 1933 after taking office was to recognize the Soviet Union, which 4 previous American presidents had refused to do. But by early 1943, it was clear that Stalin needed and the Soviets needed more aid, and also that Roosevelt and Churchill needed to appease Stalin. The Soviets were bearing the brunt of land warfare, and Stalin, reasonably, had been demanding a second front, and both Roosevelt and Churchill had been directly lying to Stalin that they were going to start a second front, which by Stalin's standards meant that they were going to which meant an invasion of Northern Europe. So to shut, oh, and then by the way, by 1943, as the American Army buildup and Air Force buildup in Europe was increasing, Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviets were going to decrease because the equipment was needed by the American forces. And Stalin was clearly going to start complaining about that. So to shut Stalin up and to prevent German offensives in the summer and fall on the Eastern Front, it was important to show Stalin that the Americans were willing to sacrifice on his behalf right now. So the question has been asked, why didn't they just wait until the Italian bases became available? It was clear that Husky was going to succeed. We already knew that Mussolini was deposed and that the Italians were not quite on our side, but had almost decided to change sides. And so bases in Italy would come available, but they weren't going to be available until at least the end of the year and possibly even into early 1944. And Stalin needed help right now. So that's why Ploesti was flown in the summer of 1943. Well, why Ploesti? Well, about a third of Europe's oil products came out of there. And of course, that was fuel for the Nazi war machine. But remember that most aviation gasoline did come from synthetics. Well, that high quality industrial lubrication oil and even lower quality petroleum products. I'm not talking about bad products. I'm just talking about lower quality than aviation gasoline. The availability of those from Romania allowed the German synthetic industry to concentrate on aviation gas. And then, of course, there was the belief by both the military and civilian leadership on the Allied side that if Ploesti was removed from the war, that it would in fact shorten the war by 6 months. The first U.S. mission against Ploesti was HALPRO, the Halverson Provisional Detachment, which was also known later on as Turkey Gets a Free Bomber Squadron. It was commanded by Harry Halverson, and it was a B-24 unit that was staging through Africa en route to China to bomb Tokyo. However, they got short-stopped in North Africa because the Chinese bases were captured by the Japanese. So on the 12th of June, the night of the 12th and the 13th, they flew the first American bombing mission, supposedly against Ploesti. This was right after Midway, just a few days after the Battle of Midway and 6 weeks or so after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. So in some sense, HALPRO was hoped to be a European Doolittle raid. Well, the results were that what Halverson succeeded in doing was scattering bombs across Romania. And the German reaction was not what you think. The conventional wisdom is the Germans said, oh my God, the Americans are coming. We've got to increase our defenses. That is absolutely incorrect. The Germans had planned to increase the defenses of Ploesti long before, many, many months before the Halverson raid. So the German reaction was, yeah, we knew that was coming, but we already got plans en route. And then, of course, with 6 of those HALPRO airplanes landing in Turkey and getting interned there, the Turks got a free bomber squadron. So here's a quick map that shows what Halverson accomplished. Those little orange devices show where bombs, but this map, by the way, is from the Romanian records, shows where the bombs actually fell. The blue dots show where Romanian ground stations identified the airplanes. At least one airplane flew almost all the way to the Ukraine before it turned back to the southwest into Romania. So now let's talk about the defenses of Ploesti. This World War I photo just absolutely intrigues me. Do you guys recognize anybody in that picture? Yeah, of course, that's Manfred von Richthofen. And that little skinny guy on the right is a man named Lieutenant Alfred Gerstenberg. Gerstenberg, by World War II, was a General Major, which in our parlance would be a brigadier general. And as I just mentioned, he was a pilot in World War I, serving with von Richthofen and also with Goering. But in the 1920s, he actually helped start the secret or restart, if you will, the secret Luftwaffe that was built up inside the Soviet Union. He commanded one of the training schools in Russia. He's a brilliant workaholic, and he was a man who got things done. He wired himself into Romanian society, and well, he sidestepped the German ambassador, and in some cases, Antonescu, who was basically the dictator of Romania. But I don't mean that as a negative point. He sidestepped them to get things done, so he didn't get wrapped up in the bureaucracy. He created a layered defense in Ploiești. Festung Ploiești means, of course, Fortress Ploiești. But I don't want to talk about the layered defense right now because I'm going to discuss that in detail in just a moment. Right now, let me talk about the refinery protection. Gerstenberg brought in German fire brigades who were well trained in fighting oil fires. Also, there was an existing pipeline ring around the city that he at least did his best to try to protect. And then, of course, the city itself had about 100% excess refining capacity for the Romanian crude oil. The Germans, about 6 weeks prior to the Tidal Wave mission, made operational 9 Freya early warning radar sites that ringed Ploiești and the capital city of Bucharest. These sites had basically just come online prior to the mission, but they were available for operation. Here's the interesting part. Those early warning radars, so-called long-range radars, were tightly controlled by General Kammhuber in Berlin, who was the commander of the 12th Fliegerkorps, which was the night fighter command in Germany, and those were for night fighting use only, at least in Romania, which means that those radars were not even turned on. I cannot find any records whatsoever in either German or Romanian archives that indicate those early warning radars were even turned on during tidal wave. Now, the Würzburg day radars were flak lane devices, and those were under the operational control of the flak regiments. So here's pictures of what we're talking about. In the upper left of Freya, in the center is a Würzburg Reise. There was only one of those, and it was a long-range radar. I don't know why they called it a Würzburg, but then the upper right-hand corner is the gun lane radar, which basically pointed the heavy flak guns, the 88s and the 105 millimeter guns. The Romanians had also set up an extensive ground observer network in Germany. The blue arrows show where the 2 places where the 2 tidal wave formations entered the country, and you can see from this Romanian map how many ground observer sites they flew over. Now, I'm jumping ahead just a little bit to tell you that although there were a lot of ground observer sites, a few of the sites had radios, and they were reporting direct by radio to the central station in Bucharest, which was the headquarters for the Observer Corps in Romania. But most of them actually used telephones. And the problem was in 1943, the Romanian telephone network was horrible. And a lot of them could not get their calls through, even to the regional centers, let alone to the central station in Romania. Beyond that, these were all manned by Romanians who really hadn't had much, if any, training at this point in the war. And they reported the airplanes flying over were B-17 Flying Fortresses. And none of the sites, I cannot find a single report from any of these reporting stations. And by the way, I've only circled the regional centers, so you can look at the small dots and see where the individual sites are. But I cannot find a single report that indicates the altitude of these airplanes, which caused the fighters to be launched to high altitude because, of course, that was American doctrine. And the fighters almost missed, the German and Romanian fighters almost missed the tidal wave attack because they were at the wrong altitude. And frankly, in some cases, only knew that the bombers were there because they could see the bombs exploding on the ground. Now, this next chart, the most important part is the upper right-hand corner where it says per ultra. These are the fighters in Romania per ultra. Most of you know what ultra was. That was the British code-breaking activity at Bletchley Park that had already broken the primary German codes that the Germans considered to be absolutely secure. Here's the important part about ultra. The information coming through ultra was what the Germans said about themselves, not what Allied intelligence people tried to divine from information that was available to them. So if it came from ultra, you could take it to the bank. So we know that on the 1st of August, there were 119 German and Romanian fighters in the Ploiești area, of which 93 were operational. That 78% in commission rate was actually not too bad for that time and that era. They also had barrage balloons in the area. This was kind of interesting. They had several companies of barrage balloons, most of which were manned by the Romanians. I think one company was German. And many of these balloons, perhaps as many as a third of them, were never launched during the attack because they did not have enough gas to fill the balloon. It's just absolutely amazing. the American crews were aware that the Germans had built a dummy refinery out to the east of the city. And you can see a picture of it here on the left side of this photograph. It doesn't look like a refinery, but it wasn't supposed to in daylight. It was intended for night bombing. And in fact, when the Soviets bombed or attempted to bomb Ploesti several times, many times actually, during 1941, most of those bombs fell on this little fake refinery out here because it was lit up at night to look like a refinery. And from 6 to 12,000 meters, the altitudes where the Soviets were flying over, it looked enough like a refinery. And of course, the real refineries were all blacked out. The Germans also used artificial smoke to obscure targets. This had worked very, very well in Northern Europe. On the Tidal Wave mission, it actually did not work. The crews reported that although there was smoke, it did not obscure their vision adequately to cause them any problems. There were really two problems on the Nazi side or the German side of all this. One was that they started up these smoke generators late because of screw-ups in the early warning, but also because, again, about a third of them never were started at all because they didn't have enough chemical to actually run them. In the Romanian archives, I found a couple of maps laying out the exact positions of the flak batteries. But again, per ultra, this, by the way, has to do with the positions where they were actually located. These are the numbers. And there were 387 flak guns in Ploesti on the 1st of August, 1943. That number came from ultra and was known to Allied intelligence. Now, whether it was known to the planners is another question. Whether it was known to the crews seems fairly unlikely, because I'm not sure too many guys would have attempted to fly into a target defended by almost 400 flak guns. So what do those numbers really mean? Well, I plotted all of those gun positions and the distances those shells could effectively fire, and this is what it looks like. The little orange dots that you see there in the center are the actual refineries, and this shows the coverage of the area. This is what the crews flew into, specifically the 44th and the 98th, which were the only two bomb groups to attack on their briefed headings. Went through flak that looked like this. The blue line, the green line, and the red lines show the formations that flew into the target area. I want to talk a bit now about the American planning, starting with what was our 1943 bombing strategy? Was it area or precision bombing? Well, by and large, precision bomb. Well, no, I won't say by and large. Absolutely, precision bombing was the intent of the American Army Air Forces. However, the British had been advocating strongly for area bombing, an argument that was supposedly finished at the Casablanca conference in January 1943, when Army Air Forces General Ira Aker briefed Churchill, and Churchill said, yeah, okay, you guys can try it. But I will tell you that by the summer of 1943, it was still an active issue, not in the minds of the Army Air Forces, but in the minds of the Allied Supreme Command and in the political leadership. But what about precision bombing? Let's look at the 8th Air Force's accuracy in 1943 from the 1st of January through the 1st of August, excluding the tidal wave attack. This is for 8th Air Force, and it comes out of 8th Air Force analysis reports. 8% of all scored bombs fell within 1,000 feet of where the bombs were supposedly aimed. By the way, that's a 2,000-foot circle. Within 1,000 feet is a 1,000-foot radius. So that's a 2,000-foot diameter circle. But 1/3 of the bombs that were dropped were outside a 3,000-foot circle and were completely omitted from the scores. So that 8% of scored bombs is nothing like 8% of the bombs that were dropped. And this is what precision bombing was in the first half of 1943 in 8th Air Force. So the insanity of a low-level attack, we have to consider that with regards to the numbers that I just showed you, that high-level bombing to accomplish the same results at Ploesti would have required more than 20 times the number of sorties, and there simply weren't that many bombers, either in Europe or Africa or them together. And also, of course, going in at low level left the possibility open of achieving surprise, which in fact they did. They achieved tactical surprise. Remember, the fighters were at high altitude when they actually arrived at the city. So all they had to do was face the flak, although you just saw the flak maps, which was no small thing. So there was literally no choice. Low level was literally the only way that they could go in. I also want to point out, and this is very, very important, that 8th and 9th Air Forces fought completely different air wars. 8th and 9th Air Forces fought completely different air wars. 8th Bomber Command attacked heavily defended targets over enemy territory most of the time, very strong defenses, and weather was a big deal. 9th Air Force, on the other hand, used heavy bombers primarily as tactical support for the British 8th Army. And as a matter of fact, 9th Bomber Command's job was support a British 8th Army. So not all of their targets were ground support or interdiction. They did bomb harbors and so forth and so on. But primarily, they were spending minimal time over enemy territory because they would fly out over the Mediterranean Ocean and fly inland, drop their bombs, and then go back out over the ocean, whether they were flying against targets in North Africa or in southern Italy or in Greece. So they spent minimal time over enemy territory and faced very light defenses. Now, the 9th Air Force bomber crews didn't think they were light defenses, but I'm going to show you something on that in just a second. And weather was seldom a factor because, after all, it's the Mediterranean. So they did. The two bomber commands did develop differently. 8th Bomber Command had large formations, and formation discipline was a very, very big deal because they had to have that to survive. Their loss rate tended to be in the 5 to 10% range, which meant, as most of you are already aware, that a bomber crew in 8th Air Force prior to the end of 1943 statistically was not going to survive his 25 missions. A 9th Bomber Command, on the other hand, operated in very, very small formations, sometimes in individual aircraft, sometimes 3 aircraft, sometimes as many as 12, but they usually bombed by individual aircraft rather than bombing by formation. And I can find no evidence whatsoever that although the two 9th Air Force bomb groups, the 98th and the 376th, might have attacked the same target, they never attacked as a joint formation of the two groups together. They always attacked as individual groups. And of course, their formation discipline was lax because it simply wasn't required by the heavy enemy defenses. So remember, I just mentioned that in 8th Air Force, the loss rates tended to be in the 5 to 10% range, whereas the 98th Bomb Group had less up until the time of Tidal Wave. 98th Bomb Group's loss rate was less than 1%. The 376 loss rate was only about 1.2%, which is only a little bit more than the 98s. Now, of course, there were bombers lost on Halpro, but I'm not counting Halpro in these numbers because Halpro preceded the formation of the 376 bomb group. So let's take a look at accuracy during Operation Husky. This was the invasion of Sicily. And it was the first time that you had 8th Air Force bomb groups and 9th Air Force bomb groups flying literally the same missions. So now we basically can compare apples to apples as opposed to apples to oranges, as we were talking about in the preceding 4 charts. The 44th bomb group put about half of their bombs inside a 2,000-foot circle. And remember, in 8th Air Force, on average, they're only getting 8% of the scored bombs inside that same 2,000-foot circle. 93rd, about a quarter. The 376th, the 98th, the two 9th Air Force groups around about 10% of their bombs inside 2,000. And of course, the 389th was this brand spanking new group direct from the U.S., which only flew 6 of 10 missions, was way down around 3%. But they got much better over the course of the war. So I want to talk about the Tidal Wave commander, Brigadier General Uzulent, who was also the 9th Bomber Command commander. He'd been a balloon guy in World War I, although he was stateside only, a West Point graduate in 24. He actually was originally in the class of 22, but he flunked out after his first semester because he did not have the mathematics skills. For you Europeans, the maths skills, sorry, in America we say math. And excuse me, the fact that he flunked out after one semester at West Point was not at all unusual at that point in time. Like many other young men, he went back, got remedial math training, came back, passed all the tests, and graduated in 1924. Became a balloon pilot in 1925, and in the late 20s and early 30s was actually an instructor at the Air Corps Navigation School. An instructor at the Air Corps Navigation School. Remember that point. But he was an odd choice because, first of all, he washed out of heavier than air pilot training not once, but twice. He washed out in 1935 and 1937. He was awarded his heavier than air wings on his 3rd try with the lowest competence scores ever graduated from an Army Air Corps pilot training program. Not a great pilot. But Between 1938 and 1942, he was the military attaché to Peru during the war that they had down there, and he was literally and legitimately a huge success. Very political, very successful. 1943, he became 9th Air Force Chief of Staff, but I want to point out he had never been a commander. He had not commanded a flight, he had not commanded a squadron, he had not commanded a group, he had not commanded a wing, right up until the time he was made commander of 9th Bomber Command. Quickly, I've mentioned all of these units before, but 8th Air Force had 3 bomb groups involved in Tidal Wave, 44th, 93rd, and the 389th. The 9th Air Force had the 98th and the 376th. And again, the 389th Bomb Group was a brand spanking new bomb group that came to North Africa directly from the US. Okay, the planned target forces. I want you to look at the blue square, which is the important information here. Of the planned airplanes to attack Ploesti, about 60% were 8th Air Force airplanes and about 40% were 9th Air Force airplanes. About 60% were 8th Air Force, about 40% were 9th Air Force. That's the planned target forces. Now I want to talk a little bit about intelligence, but I really want to focus on 2 things on the Allied side. One is that amazingly accurate production information. It turns out that Allied intelligence had very, very accurate and timely information about what was being produced in Ploesti and where it was going. And the reason they did was because the oil refining community was quite small worldwide, and everybody knew each other, and the oil men talked to each other, and the American oil men told the intelligence people, and they knew what was going on. But also there were the ultra decrypts, which I alluded to before, ultra being the message decryption that the Brits were running out of England, and we got very good information out of ultra. Now on the Axis side, the German radio intelligence was absolutely phenomenal. It was so good that the German radio intelligence operators could identify individual crews by the Morse keys of the radio operator. They literally could they could identify them by code letter on the airplane just by listening to the Morse code. But on top of that was abysmal operations security by 9th Air Force radio operators. As a matter of fact, the morning of Tidal Wave, the morning of the 1st of August, before the airplanes took off, the radio operators were tuning up their radios, and one of them was heard by German radio intelligence in Athens, Greece, to say to another guy in another airplane, "I hope you have a lot of water and food because it's going to be a really long flight today." Maybe not what you want the enemy to hear. And of course, we already talked about radar and the ground observers. So there were 7 refineries targeted. I'm not going to go through these in detail because I'm going to address them a little bit more later on. This is the layout. You saw a smaller version of this in the flak coverage chart that I showed you earlier. But basically, they ringed the city of Ploesti, and then the one at the bottom, the orange at the bottom. Hopefully you can see my little arrow there. That's at Baraj, Romania. That was an important, fairly new refinery that was actually producing a pretty fair amount of aviation gasoline. And then the 7th refinery was at the small city of Câmpina, which is about roughly 15 miles north of Ploesti. That was the target for the 389th, but I didn't want to show it on this map because it would have made things too small. And the planned route, which I think most people are familiar with, is fly north from Benghazi to the island of Corfu, turn to the northeast, fly to Ploesti, and then fly back home, basically repeating the route. The planning for this in detail was the most elaborate in the history of the U.S. Army. There are 3-dimensional scale models, there were innovative maps, and then, of course, there were the films. Those three-dimensional scale models were so accurate that a couple of the planners of this mission were British Army officers who had actually been refinery managing directors before the war, and they could identify their houses on those 3-dimensional maps. Absolutely amazing. Well, the Brits put an 8mm film camera on a tricycle and ran that tricycle across the top of the maps so that there were eye-level movies that the pilots and bombardiers could watch. Now, the planned attack, again, this is pretty familiar to anybody who's done any reading whatsoever on the tidal wave attack, was to approach the target area from the approach the target area from the west-southwest, passing the city of Târgoviște, and then arriving at the small town of Florești, at which point, just past Florești, they would turn to the southeast, cross their targets in the city of Ploiești, and then do a dogleg after they got south of the town and fly back home. That was the plan. I'm going to talk about these 3D models a little bit more. I think I had that slide out of order. I apologize. There were 5 different models, 3-dimensional models of the area. In the top picture, I just love that top picture. Those strings show the approach corridors for the 98th Bomb Group on the target White 4 Astra Romana. Pretty amazing stuff. And they were the models were built in the United Kingdom, but they were shipped to North Africa, where the planners and the pilots and bombardiers were able to actually study the maps. Pretty cool stuff. I'm not going to talk about this map in details, but this does show 3 possible routes for the 389th Bomb Group to approach their target in Câmpina, Romania. Excuse me. This is really innovative stuff here. These are people that are using their heads for something besides a hat rack. And then, of course, there were the standard route maps, the air maps that were very common. This is an American map based upon a British map. The British map was based upon Romanian maps that were drawn in the late 1800s. And the British cartographers felt that the Romanian cartographers were the worst cartographers in Europe. So luckily, the crews did not know that. Also, they had sketch artists draw out various landmarks along the route so that they could compare what they were seeing out their windows with what they were seeing on the maps. This is very, very innovative stuff. But not everything the planners devised was a smashing good idea. I'm not sure who thought this was brilliant. I want you to watch this video. This was the 98th Bomb Group's planned final turn to go from the town of Ploesti into the target area at Ploesti. This is the formation approaching in their normal bomb group formation. This is the change into the wide V that was supposedly going to cross the target. Please tell me which one of those pilots you would like to be. I had this graphic made up based upon information I found in the target folders from the Ploesti mission for the 98th Bomb Group. And my initial reaction then and my reaction right now is, oh my God. So this is the final formation that was supposed to cross their assigned target area. So who thought that was brilliant? But White 4, Astra Romana, was the most important refinery in Romania, but it was a very, very difficult target because substantial air discipline was going to be required during that final approach, because although the target area was about 2,000 feet wide, the individual pinpoint target approach corridors were only between 90 and 230 feet wide. How many B-24s can you get into a 90-foot wide approach corridor? Or for that matter, a 230-foot wide approach corridor. So I know this is going to come as a shock to you. NFW. If you don't know what NFW is, ask a military friend. So in reality, and once again, I'm jumping ahead just a little bit. In actuality, John Kane, the commander of the 98th, turned a little bit early. And when he did, he basically turned his formation on top of the 44th Bomb Group, which was turning at the right place. And was supposed to be flying to the right of the 98th. But what ended up happening was some of the 98th airplanes were more or less mixed in with the 44th. They weren't physically mixed in, they were actually over the top of. And so on that 98's final approach to the target area, which is not even their specific pinpoint targets, the final approach was broken up and they had ships all over the sky, and only a few of them actually crossed the briefed refinery, let alone the specific pinpoint targets. So now I'm going to sort of catch up with myself and talk about execution. So it's always been a question, did the Germans and the Romanians know that the Ploesti attack was coming? Well, in a general sense, yes, because it was so obvious. Did they know it was coming on the 1st of August? Well, we've already discussed Gerstenberg, who was the overall commander in the area, and the Yafu, the Jagdführer, Voldenga, Colonel Voldenga, was an experienced fighter pilot. He was the fighter leader, and the Flak was Colonel Bauer, who was an extremely experienced flak officer in the Luftwaffe. Gerstenberg was at a spa in the northern part of Romania, and did not get back to Bucharest, which was his headquarters, until the mission was basically over. Voldenga was not at his headquarters. He was off someplace which I have not yet identified, but he did not get to his headquarters at all during the attack. And Bauer, once again, was off someplace. Remember, this is a Sunday, the 1st of August, 1943. No attack was expected. Why would they be in their headquarters? So what was left was a flak officer on Gerstenberg's staff named Doring Manteuffel, who was also a very experienced flak commander, although he's in the staff job right now. And then Major Douglas Pitcairn, the German fighter ace with the Scottish name, was a fighter controller, and he was in command since Voldenga was not available. And these men were very successful. And this indicates that Gerstenberg had put outstanding people on his staff and had trained his troops well. But let's talk about 9th Air Force's mechanisms of failure. Okay, we had a couple of crashes. We had the initial crash of the 98th Bomb Group's Kickapoo right on takeoff, which was definitely a downer for all of the other crews taking off, because every single airplane that took off from the Benghazi area could see that huge plume of smoke, as seen in this photograph right here. And then, of course, the 376 bomber Wongo Wongo spun in for unknown reasons over the Mediterranean. Now, you will remember that Wongo Wongo was supposedly the mission lead for the entire tidal wave attack. That is palpable BS. And again, if you don't know what BS is, ask a military person. That was not true then, was not true now, and we have proof of that. But beyond that, John Kane, the commander of the 98th, flew at reduced power settings en route, which caused the formation to come apart. The order of groups flying at that point in time was the 376 bomb group in front, the 93rd bomb group right behind them, then the 98th bomb group, and then the 44th and the behind the 98th, and the 389th behind the 44th. So when Kane slowed down, because he wanted to conserve fuel, he was afraid he wasn't going to be able to make the entire flight without crashing into the sea on the way home. What that did was it separated the following 3 groups from the first 2 groups, which meant 2 completely different formations actually ended up going into Romania. We'll talk about that in a little bit more. Now, also, there was a weather front that they encountered over Yugoslavia, and Kane penetrated that differently than the first 2 groups did. And so, hold on a second here. I apologize. My phone going off in the middle of a presentation. I thought I had it turned off. Okay. That weather front penetration created even more separation between the two groups of groups, and they had lost sight of each other. Now, General Ent, the mission commander, who was in fact in the lead airplane the entire way from takeoff to reaching the Ploesti area, turned early and flew down to Bucharest. I'm going to talk about that in a second. He signaled mission successful back to Benghazi for God only knows what reason, because he had absolutely no way of knowing whether the mission had been successful. And then, of course, he also radioed a general release of the crews to hit targets of opportunity. I'll talk about that in just a moment as well. So basically what ended up happening was the 376 bomb group with General Ent in the lead airplane, flown by Colonel Compton, the group commander, as I said, did lead the formation from the very beginning. And again, recalling that Ent had been an Air Corps navigation instructor, even though Compton knew exactly where he was at the first initial point of Trgovishta, and not at the second initial point, which is where the turn was supposed to occur. And by the way, Trgovishta and Ploesti, which are the 2 initial points, looked nothing like each other. And the crews had been very specifically briefed by British officers who had lived in the areas about how about the differences in the way the 2 towns looked. So Ent ordered that early turn that took him down to Bucharest. And I want to point out, because I've been pretty critical of 9th Air Force, but I want to be very, very clear that none of this was the fault of the crews. You cannot blame a pilot for following the command or the lead of his commander. This was a failure of leadership, and specifically a failure of leadership by the mission commander. So the 376 failed in their sojourn to Romania. Not one bomb was dropped on their target, and of course, per Ent's order, they flew in a big circle around the city while watching the other units attack the targets. But 5 individual 376 pilots acting on their own initiative did either bomb or attempt to bomb, and 3 were even successful and created a substantial amount of damage, just those 3 airplanes by themselves. So this is, at least notionally, what the 376 excursion around the city of Ploesti looked like. I actually have a much more detailed map, but there's not enough time for a moving map, animated map, but there's nowhere near enough time tonight to show you that. I want to talk about what showed up in the Stewart and Dugan book, the infamous flak train, which supposedly was on the tracks between Ploesti and Ploesti, and then fired on the 44th on the right and the 98th on the left. Problem is that flak train did not exist. According to German and Romanian documentation, there were only 2 flak trains in the Romania in July and August of 1943, and both of them were in the city of Constanța, which is on the Black Sea coast on the east side of Romania. They were nowhere near Ploiești, and there was no chance of them getting to Ploiești. The flak train did not exist. So what the crews thought was coming, flak fire from the train, was actually coming from flak emplacements that were near the train tracks. The 98th bomb group failed at their target, which was White 4, not White 5, as I've said here. That's a typo, I apologize. This actually, right now you're looking at a map created by the Romanians. The Romanians required every single refinery to plot every single bomb hit on the refinery. And I have highlighted in red, this is the map that shows all the 1944 bomb hits as well. But I have plotted in red the bomb hits excuse me, from the 1st of August, 1943. And what you can see from this is that a significant amount of the damage that was caused there was actually caused by the 93rd bomb group, which attacked basically right into the sounds of the guns. 93rd attacked from the southeast, while the much later, probably close to 15 minutes later, the 98th came in on roughly the 127 degree that you see in the with the blue arrow. They really weren't on quite that heading, but because as I've already explained to you, Kane turned early, which took them off that 127 degree heading, and individual pilots were not able to line up on their pinpoint targets, which is why you see so few bombs in the target area. But the 98th was cut to pieces by flak. They lost 21 airplanes, which was almost half of their formation. And the reason that they did was they flew in too damned high. They were supposed to be down at 250 feet. Kane claimed in his diary, which is not really a diary, but a post-war recapitulation of what might have been an original diary. He claimed in that unpublished diary that he told his crews repeatedly, "Get low or you'll die." Well, they didn't. Some of those 98 airplanes were as high as 800 to 1,000 feet. There's actually another picture that I'm not showing here today that clearly shows an airplane up high, but he's kind of obscured by smoke, and it's hard to see in that picture. In this picture alone, you can see airplanes that are right around 500 feet, 400 feet, which puts them in the sights of the flak guns much longer than if they were down at 250 feet where they were supposed to be. Now remember that approximately 60%, roughly 60% of the planned airplanes were supposed to come from 8th Air Force and about 40% from 9th Air Force. The reality was that almost 70% of the airplanes at the target were 8th Air Force, and about 30% were from 9th Air Force. So 8th Air Force got to the target area, and 9th Air Force, by and large, did not. It's the numbers are just absolutely astounding. And the reason why the 9th Air Force numbers are so low is the 376 did not attack except for those 5 airplanes. So in the words of General Leon Johnson, who was a colonel at the time, when he was interviewed right after the mission, is, "We were dragged through the mouth of hell." Some came home. By the way, I love the picture in the upper left-hand corner. I love the guy in the plaid shirt. I'm not quite sure. Maybe that's a 9th Air Force uniform. I'm not totally sure about that. But these are guys literally waiting for the Tidal Wave bombers to come back. So some men came home, but many did not. We talked for just a little bit about Pete Hughes, who was a pilot in the 389th Bomb Group. And this was the first time in history that a Medal of Honor earner was photographed actually earning that medal. There's a YouTube video that claims that Chappie Chapman, an Air Force combat controller in Afghanistan, was the first time it was photographed. That's phrased incorrectly. It's the first time it was actually videoed or motion picture film. Pete Hughes was the first time it was actually photographed. And here's his airplane. And again, I apologize. This is a pretty small picture to be able to see, but you can see his airplane burning fiercely from the waist. His Bombay fuel tanks are on fire, and the flames are spreading back across the aft end of the airplane. You can see flames coming out of the bomb bay, and almost the entire back end of the airplane is engulfed. And then this is the airplane cartwheeling into the ground. 2 men actually survived, amazingly enough, but this is an airplane. This is not a position that any aviator wants to be in. You've got a wing that's buckling under you in the ground, and the rest of the airplane's about to come apart around you. And this is what it looked like afterwards. This is literally video of his airplane as it looked on the ground. And in the lower left-hand corner, people with weak stomachs should look away, because that is a dead American aviator being dragged away by Romanian soldiers. Now I'm going to talk about the aftermath. And again, as I told you at the beginning of this presentation, I'm only hitting the highlights, the top of the highlights, because this is a complex story, and I have to leave out so much that I wish I had time to tell you tonight, but I don't. I'm not going to discuss all of the statistics on this page. You can rerun the video on YouTube or Facebook later on if you want to, but I want to point out that 54 B-24s were lost, which was 30%. That included those 8 airplanes that went to Turkey. So about a third of the airplanes were actually lost, and about a third of the airplanes, roughly a third of the airplanes, were damaged, with about 500 airmen lost. As usual, the Americans claimed way more enemy fighters shot down that were actually shot down. They claimed 51, but actually only 6 were shot down by the Americans, including, by the way, a Romanian squadron commander. By unit, I want to point out that the 93rd Bomb Group lost about 38% of its airplanes, and the 93rd lost 38%, the 98th lost 46%. We've already talked about the 98th. The reason why the 93rd Bomb Group's losses were so high was because it was not their fault, but they flew almost directly across the top of a 20 millimeter German 20 millimeter flak gun battery that just shot the crap out of them. And they had a bunch of airplanes lost. As a matter of fact, one of those airplanes crashed into the penitentiary in the city of Ploesti, crashed into the women's wing, and about 90 women were killed in the fire. Interestingly enough, I have Romanian documents that indicate that the male inmates in that penitentiary begged the warders to let them help rescue the women, and they wouldn't let them out of their cells. And so almost certainly more people died than were necessary. But by far the greatest loss of life were the women killed in that crash into the penitentiary. Now, interestingly enough, neither the Romanian people nor the Romanian government blamed the Americans for that. They understood that an airplane crashing into a building is just an accident of war. That 33%, 33% loss rate, everybody really keys in on that as being an indicator that this was a failed mission. But I also want to point out that the 16 May 1943 dam busters attack on the German dams, 42% of those airplanes were shot down. 42% versus 33% on Tidal Wave. And people don't talk about the dam buster raids being a failure. And then, of course, there's the absolutely infamous 17 May 43 disaster for the 322nd Bomb Group, where all 10 of the airplanes they sent were shot down. And there's a reason for that. We don't have time to go into it, but the entire bomb group, or at least the entire operational part of the bomb group, was destroyed in one day. And then in September 1944, historian Roger Freeman said that the largest loss of any bomb group in the entirety of World War II was the 445th Bomb Group at Kassel, Germany, where they lost 80% of their airplanes. So that 33% on Ploesti, that's 54 airplanes and all the crewmen involved in those airplanes. It's a big loss. There's no doubt about it. But let's keep this in perspective. The dam busters had a higher loss. The 322nd had, there are other ones as well. And then, of course, obviously there are many missions where the loss rate was lower. I'm just trying to give you some perspective here. 5 Medals of Honors were earned on this mission. By the way, a man is not awarded the Medal of Honor. He earns the Medal of Honor. And 2 men earned it that were still alive, Johnson of 44th and Kane of the 98th. Those were both the group commanders. And then posthumously, Addison Baker, the commander of the 93rd, earned the Medal of Honor, and John Gerstenberg, who was his co-pilot, also earned it. And then, of course, Pete Hughes, which we talked about just a little while ago, with the photographs from the 389th, was earned it. And that was all done in about a 15-minute window. So these were the most for one day, except the Civil War Battle of Antietam, as far as I am able to tell. And by the way, I have tried to work with the Medal of Honor Society, and they have not been able to help me. They believe also that this is the most in one day since Antietam, but somebody may have better information than that. But I will tell you, there were not 5 Medals of Honor won in 15 minutes at the Battle of Antietam in the Civil War. So in contrast, I want you to pay attention to this. In contrast to those Medals of Honor, General Brereton, the 9th Air Force commander, submitted recommendations for one or more high military decorations for every man on the mission, except, General Ent. And General Arnold, Hap Arnold, the chief of the Army Air Forces, actually noticed that omission. He asked Brereton, okay, if this mission was the great success that you claim it was, why is the mission commander omitted from the decoration submissions that we've received here? And he wrote a letter to Brereton, and I have a copy of it, and it's a masterpiece of, I order you to, ... without actually using those words. And of course, Ent got his medal. The results of the mission in terms of assessments were the British assessed it as about 42.5% total refining destroyed for 6 months. That number is very well known. The Romanians themselves reported 45%. So those are basically the same number when you get down there. But what it did in effect was it eliminated the excess refining capacity, because remember, they had basically 100% excess capacity. But more important than that was to get their production back up, they had to put back into service really old, and some of those were extremely old refineries and very, very small refineries, turning out basically crappy products, very low quality products. But it kept the numbers up, which is important. So what was the reaction of Hitler or German High Command, OKW? None. Not, I kid you not, there was no impact on Hitler or the German staff. And the reason there was no impact was, of course, there were so many other things going on that were unbelievably important to them. The massive loss at Stalingrad, the Battle of Kursk, which they were in the process of getting their butts kicked, the invasion of Sicily, Mussolini being deposed, the dams raids, which flooded the Ruhr Valley, the firebombing of Hamburg. And then finally, and this is something that I had to study, I've got a whole separate presentation on the Nazi war economy that runs for about 2.5 hours. I couldn't understand why this was a big deal. Why did it have no effect on the on the most senior Germans, that is to say? And the reason they didn't was that German war economy was not centrally planned and not really even coordinated. It's just an amazing story. I'm just catching the highlights here, but basically, the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing, and more to the point, the left hand didn't care what the right hand was doing. So, as a practical matter, the 376 target was not even bombed. White 2, which was supposedly, not supposedly, was the 93rd's target. The 93rd was unable to hit that because they came in from a different angle. But the 376 bomb group ships led by Norm Appold actually created a pretty substantial amount of damage just in that one refinery. So all 3 of those airplanes were very successful in their bombing. White 3, which was also a 93rd target, was not bombed, again, because the 93rd came in from about 90 degrees off their briefed heading. The 98th, remember I said the 98th was not successful? Whatever bombs they dropped on that refinery, which is White 4, Astra Romana, created a 3-week loss of minor refinery products, and then it was back in full production. Now, on the other hand, in the 8th Air Force, White 5, the 44th Bomb Group, knocked their refinery out of the war. They had a second refinery, the Blue Target, down in the city of Barrage. They knocked that out of the war. And the 389th, the brand new 389th up north in Kimpina, knocked their refinery out of the war. Not a bad outing by the 8th Air Force. Now, on the other side, the Romanian government and the Romanian people were shocked and impressed by all of this. Obviously, they knew the Americans were likely to bomb, but even a Romanian government minister said it was like they were placing eggs in a basket. They were so accurate in their bombing. Now, it is true that very little stored, which is to say in tanks, finished product or raw products was destroyed, and that's kind of a big deal. The refining capacity was seriously damaged, but it would have been even more helpful to destroy all of that finished material in the tanks. And there's a long story behind that, but the crews were told not to do it because they were afraid they were going to blow up in their faces, which happened in a couple of cases anyway. But had the crews been told to blow up those tanks on their way out of town, the mission would have been dramatically more successful. And of course, I already mentioned the old inefficient refineries being restarted. But also, it's very important to understand that the product mix after Tidal Wave changed, because not all petroleum products have equal value. So an Opel truck can run all day on 60 octane gasoline, but try putting that 60 octane in a BF 109. Let's see how far that's going to get you. And then on top of that, of course, high precision munitions machinery requires high quality lubricating oil. And by the way, you cannot get high quality lubricating, or at least they could not get high quality lubricating oil out of the synthetic oil process. It had to come from crude oil. So Ploesti provided the bulk of the high quality lube oil to the German war industries. And of course, the German Navy used bunker oil, which is basically thick as molasses and even cruder than other oils. So if you try swapping those two oils, that's not going to work very well either. I mentioned earlier that there have been a lot of lies about this, or at least incorrect conventional wisdom. And the lie started with the cover-up started, and it really is a lie, with the official history in 1944, where they claimed that the lead aircraft, Wongo crashed en route, and then the deputy lead went down to try to look for survivors and then went back. RTB returned to base. He did crash en route. His best friend did go down and look for survivors, but he was never the lead aircraft, and the guy that went down to look for survivors was never the deputy lead aircraft for the mission. That is a hard no. The official history claimed that the mission commander's aircraft was well back in the formation, didn't see the leader go down. Absolutely, positively false, and easily proven to be false. They also said that the mission formation split into two segments due to that weather front penetration over Yugoslavia that I mentioned earlier. Well, that's sort of true, but the separation actually started to occur prior to that, when the 98th Bomb Group commander, John Kane, flew at reduced power settings. There's a whole story behind that as well that I wish I had time to tell you. But the two segments, it's true that there were two segments, and it's true that the weather front was part of the problem, but the other part of the problem was John Kane going against orders and flying at reduced power settings. And then also the official history claims that at some point the commander's plane took the lead. No, he didn't. He was in front of the entire time. And then he turned early about 10 minutes before the IP, and that, of course, is true. And then it's also true that the second segment arrived about roughly 13 minutes later and attacked exactly as briefed. So the takeaways that I'd like to suggest for all of this is that, or to remind you of, I should say, of all this, is it was conducted specifically to help Stalin. It was carefully planned, and they knew the defenses were strong, but it was poorly commanded. And again, I want to make this absolutely crystal clear that whatever failures there were on this mission does not reflect on the combat crews. It absolutely was not their fault. If a man flew to Ploesti, whether he attacked or not, and remember, the pilot was the guy. There may be 10 airplanes, 9 or 10 guys on the airplane, but it's the pilot that puts it, either there or not there. The guys that went there were all heroes, and the guys that did not attack, it wasn't their fault. Their commander didn't attack, so they followed their commander. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, General Ent successfully avoided the battle. Now, let me just mention, Ent avoided the battle. General Johnson told me specifically that he had talked to Ent the night before the mission and came away from that conversation firmly believing that Ent had no intention. Ent had no intention of going into Ploesti. General Johnson told me that directly. That's one data point. However, it also turns out that the one and only non-American, a Royal Air Force officer who flew on this mission, also talked to Ent the night before the mission, and also came away, it's a separate conversation, by the way, came away firmly believing that Ent had no intention of going into Ploesti. And he actually said that in writing. So that's two data points. I think it's pretty clear that whether Ent intended to go into the battle, or into Ploesti or not, he certainly gave the indication to senior people that he was not going to do that. I mentioned already, and I hope I've explained adequately, that the two Air Forces, 8th and 9th, trained and operated differently, and that had a direct impact on the results. The 9th Air Force units did very, very well. The 44th, 389th knocked their targets out of the war. The 93rd, and I really didn't spend a lot of time talking about what they did because there's too many other things to cover. But I want to point out and emphasize that the commander of the 93rd who earned the Medal of Honor, Addison Baker, rode to the sounds of the guns. He was following Ent in the 376th and broke away from him basically just north of Bucharest, and rode to the sound of the guns. Bad circumstances, and his bombers did in fact cause some pretty serious damage to the 44th and 98th targets. I believe that it is a valid statement to make that it would have required a miracle for 9th Air Force to perform well. They simply weren't prepared for it, and it's not their fault. It's not even the fault of the commanders. They had a different war. Now, there were command failures, but it would have required a miracle for 9th Air Force. They didn't have the air discipline. They weren't used to this kind of defenses. There were all kinds of reasons why 9th Air Force failed in their and leadership failures were only one of them. But again, for the 5th or 6th time, I want to reiterate that the men cannot be blamed for their leaders' failures. It is not the pilot's fault. It is no crew member's fault. These were leadership failures. I've also pointed out that the product mix changed dramatically after the attack, and the quality dropped. They were shipping more high quality products before. Now, by the way, the numbers did not drop dramatically, but the reason that the numbers based upon tons or gallons or carloads of finished petroleum products shipped did not drop all that much after the mission. It did drop some, but it didn't drop all that much. But it's the mix that matters. This is again an example where gross statistics don't tell the story very clearly, and you've got to get into the details to really understand what was happening. So they may have shipped the same amount, but it wasn't the same stuff. The Romanians were deeply affected by this attack, and the Germans really weren't all that much. They were prepared to defend Ploesti. They were already plans well in advance of the Tidal Wave attack, as there were plans in advance of the Halpro attack to increase the defenses. Had nothing to do with either one of those two attacks. And of course, I already mentioned that the political repercussions were essentially zero on the part of the German senior leadership. And as far as I can tell, Stalin basically shut up about the Second Front. So in that respect, this political operation was successful. So finally, I'm going to wrap this up. You heard the story, seen the statistics, you've seen the results, and I want to re-emphasize these are the results reported by the Romanians and the Germans, not primarily by Allied intelligence people who could make mistakes, working honestly, but still make mistakes. What was reported by Ultra, what I have found in thousands of pages of original documents in the German and Romanian archives, is what has led to the presentation that I've given here tonight and all the background information that you have not heard here tonight. So let me ask you again, which color best represents the Tidal Wave attack? The 9th Air Force pink or the 8th Air Force green? I hope I have made it pretty clear to you which one of those is the better representation of the Tidal Wave attack. So the final word I want to give here tonight on the presentation is what the United States Strategic Bombing Survey said at the end of the war. Hitler started World War II without enough liquid fuel. He had to fight much of the time for liquid fuel. He was deprived of the bulk of his sources of such fuel by the strategic bombing of oil targets. And then they went on to say in the last year of the war, but also the losses in, I didn't say this earlier, the losses, the destruction rather, in Ploesti was greater on Tidal Wave than it was in all of the 1944 attacks put together. I find that absolutely amazing. But of course, remember, all of that destruction essentially just took away the Tidal Wave destruction, took away the excess refining capacity and the high quality refining capacity. In the 1944 oil campaign bombing took away almost all the rest of it. Now, I've got a book on all of this coming out, I hope next year. I hope. Fingers crossed, knock on wood. Tentatively entitled Dragged Through the Mouth of Hell, Context to Heroism at Ploesti, 1 August 1943. And you get a lot more information in the book, explanations, photos, maps, so on. All of the things I've discussed today with all the background information behind all those things, plus a ton more information will be in the book. And then I hope to release a documentary film on DVD or Blu-ray after the book is released, if I'm lucky next year. But I think I've actually got my hands on all of the surviving Tidal Wave film footage that I have digitally improved or will digitally improved, and then of course hundreds of photos that it will be included and moving graphics and so on, so on, so on. So as I say, with luck, that'll be released next year, although it'll probably be the year after. Of course, it took me almost 4 decades to get to where I am right now, so I wouldn't necessarily make any major bets on me having this stuff come out. But I'm ready for this project to wrap up. Now, my website, I've got 2 of them. One is low-level-ploesti.org. That's my website for the book and the documentary project. And then I also produce and sell scale model airplane decals, and I've done among many other things, I have done hundreds of sheets and thousands of airplanes on those various decal sets. But I've also done detailed markings for 30 of the Tidal Wave B-24s, and you can see those on my fineartofdecals.com website if you'd like. So with that, I thank you.
Yes, thank you. For decades of research into a little over an hour is quite a monumental task, and I'm sure there are so many more details that that you have to share. But just some fascinating insights tonight that sort of changed my view of these raids as well. And just watching the comments on Facebook and YouTube, I think our audience is very appreciative of you sharing your knowledge with us. And in fact, there are several that are asking if we can have you back as a repeat guest. So we'll talk about that. But a few of the questions that have come up. John was wondering, when they removed the gun turrets, did they cover them up, or were they just left exposed before the mission?
Yeah, good question. Covered them up. It was real simple to just pop rivet some sheet aluminum over that hole.
Sure.
And by the way, the turrets were removed. Even in 8th Air Force, the turrets were removed from B-24Ds in 1944. So it was no big deal to cover up that hole.
Let's see. Keith Compton and Leon Johnson both went on to be general officers in the Air Force. It's safe to say that this raid didn't hurt their careers, but Colonel Kane's career floundered. Your speculations on why?
Yeah, absolutely. Excuse me. I had a chart in here that I took out that I actually went through the post-Tidal Wave, well, not the careers, but basically where all of these guys ended up. So Brereton, the commander of 9th Air Force, ended up as a 3-star general. Ent ended up as a 2-star general. And oh, by the way, remember I said that Ent was a horrible pilot? Well, in 1944, when he was the commander of by the way, I should mention, again, this is a chart that I took out, but I do want to mention it because fair is fair. Ent was a failure as a combat commander. That's absolutely clear. However, he was brought back to the United States because there were no more jobs available for him under Eisenhower. Eisenhower was done with Ent. But he came back to the States, and Hap Arnold made him the commander of 2nd Air Force in Colorado Springs, which was responsible for training B-29 combat crews for the Pacific. And in that job, Uzulent was an absolute success. Arnold was just happy as a pig in mud, or whatever else a pig is happy in. And, excuse me, but again, as I said, Ent was a horrible pilot. In 1944, he was on a inspection trip down in Tucson, Arizona, and going home, getting ready to fly home, or in the process of flying home to Colorado Springs. He was piloting the airplane, and all of the pilots in this audience will recognize that rolling down the runway during your takeoff run, wheels still on the runway, it is an exceptionally bad idea to retract the landing gear, which is exactly what Ent did. He retracted the landing gear on his B-25 as he was rolling down the runway, and the airplane pancaked in. Nobody on the airplane was hurt except Ent, because one of the blades on the left-hand engine broke off and sliced through the fuselage and hurt Ent quite badly, and he ended up dying from that injury in 1948, 4 years later. But Ent was legitimately a huge success at training B-29 crews. Now, the question, however, had to do with John McCain. And by the way, you will have noticed that I have never once referred to him as Killer Kane, because as far as I'm concerned, that gives him some notoriety that he does not deserve, in my opinion. There are going to be people who disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine, but I'm not going to do that. Here's the thing about, I should also mention, we mentioned Leon Johnson retiring as a 4-star general, but he also retired as a 4-star general not once, but twice. There's a whole story behind that we don't have time for. K.K. Compton retired as the 376 Bomb Group commander, retired as a 3-star general. Jack Wood, the commander of the 389th, retired as a major general, 2-star general. Addison Baker, of course, was killed on the mission. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Let me take a drink of water here. And then we come to John Kane. Excuse me. Kane was a full colonel at the time of this mission. When he retired in 1953 from the United States Air Force, he was still a colonel, embittered, and, oh, by the way, shunned by the other senior officers from Tidal Wave. They had nothing to do with him afterwards. Part of the reason they had nothing to do with him afterwards was when Kane came back from the desert, he was assigned in the Pentagon because they didn't have a job for him for a while. So he was basically just puttering around the Pentagon. He wrote several letters that basically attempted to make him the hero of this mission. I have those letters. They are unbelievable. And of course, once the other senior officers found out what John Kane was doing, they were not too appreciative of that. And as a matter of fact, General Johnson told me specifically, now, this is General Johnson's opinion, but General Johnson told me specifically that he did not think that Kane deserved the Medal of Honor. He thought Norm Appold deserved the Medal of Honor instead of Kane. But again, there's a whole story behind that. It was political. So Kane retired as a colonel long after the war, embittered at the Air Force. If you look at his interviews with the local newspaper there in Louisiana, in the town where he retired, his bitterness is absolutely palpable, absolutely palpable.
Yeah, now you mentioned the documentary coming out with your book. There's, at least to my knowledge, there's never been a Hollywood film that's been made on the raid. Has there?
No, not a Hollywood film. Funny you should mention that. It turns out that the daughter of K.K. Compton, I hope I got that right. Anyway, the daughter of K.K. Compton has a son and a daughter who are both producers in Hollywood, and she has seen another version of this presentation and indicated that she might be willing to try to talk her son and daughter into trying to get a Hollywood production of this. And of course, with computer graphics in this era, they could just do an absolute bang up job if they chose to.
Why were there no fighter escorts with this mission?
Well, it's very simple. It was a 2,400 miles round trip. There was no fighter that had even remotely that kind of range. And remember, the P-51, although the P-51 physically existed in August of 1943, it was not yet the fighter that it became in late 43, and then, of course, all the way through the rest of the war. So there were no fighters that had anywhere near enough range. Now, interestingly enough, once the bombers moved up to the Italian bases, they were, in fact, escorted by fighters, by both P-51s and P-38s on their attacks to Ploesti.
Was there ever any discussion of having the Navy involved in any way?
If there was, I've never seen even a hint of that.
Okay.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. Let me take that back. Not the American Navy.
Okay.
It turns out that the British were deeply involved in this mission on every single respect, every single aspect of this mission, except for the actual flying of the mission. And of course, one RAF officer was in fact on the mission itself. He was the only non-American. But the British were ready to pick up survivors from the Mediterranean because the expectation was is that bombers would be going down in the water, and the British had, particularly the RAF, not even the Royal Navy, had air sea rescue boats that were staged to do that. And as a matter of fact, one of the airplanes that crashed just off the beach on the coastline of Turkey, an airplane called Hadley's Harem, the crew, well, all but a couple of the guys in the crew got out of the airplane and basically swam to the beach because it was quite close. And because the airplane crashed in the water, they were considered to be marooned mariners, as opposed, and were in fact not interned. Although what's interesting was the RAF Air Sea Rescue boat that went to pick them up because they knew where they were. When the boat commander went ashore, the Turkish troops that were there grabbed him as well as the crew members, and they all ended up taking a slight sojourn in the capital city of Turkey for about a month and a half, and then they were all released.
Given the involvement of the 8th Air Force, was General Doolittle ever considered in the planning of this mission?
Not in the planning. Actually, in no respect. It's really interesting. Doolittle, I'm trying to remember, was Doolittle commander of 12th Air Force at this point? I can't remember if he was in North Africa or England.
I think, well, yes. I
Yeah,
think he was still in
exactly.
North Africa.
Yeah, well, I think
Yep.
that's correct. I think he was commander of 12th Air Force.
Yep.
And you need to understand that 12th Air Force, in the eyes of the Army Air Forces writ large, was the American Air Force in Africa. Because remember, 9th Air Force's job was to support the British 8th Army. I mean, that literally was their job the entire time of their existence. And then, of course, 9th Air Force was disestablished in North Africa, and the two bomb groups and the fighters and the transports and the medium bombers all went over to 12th Air Force. And then, of course, 12th Air Force then quickly became 15th Air Force. So it went from 9th to 12th to 15th in a very short period of time. But Doolittle was commander of, but remember, 12th Air Force in Northwest Africa was supporting Americans, whereas 9th Air Force in North Africa, Western and Central North Africa, was supporting the Brits. So as far as the Army Air Forces was concerned corporately, 12th was the Air Force and 9th was just sort of there.
All right. Well, that will wrap up our questions from our audience. And again, there was some great banter back and forth on social media. So we thank all of you for not only participating by watching, but also by interacting with your fellow viewers on social media. We appreciate that. And David, we're going to have to figure out a good time to have you back to talk about the book and the documentary, and probably some more insights into this very fascinating chapter in history.
Well, I'm sorry to say I can talk for as long as you want to listen.
Well, there we go.
Cool. Hey, by the way, I know we're at the tail end of things. Do you want me to show those two 10-second videos?
Oh, yes. Yes. Please do. David has a couple of videos.
Yeah, they're just real short videos here. This is Brewery Wagon, which is an airplane that actually crash landed in Romania during the mission. And I thought this was a pretty cool little set of film here. And I have, as an aside, I've actually done model airplane decals, and this is the artwork. And I want to acknowledge my good friend Andy Gaster, who was the artist who actually did the actual nose art for this airplane. Andy is an amazing guy. So this is Brewery Wagon, and then this one is the Sandman, which is a very famous veteran. They did make it back home to Benghazi after the mission. But this is again, a pretty cool airplane named the Sandman. And of course, the Sandman came from the fact that they were actually based in the sand of North Africa. So anyway, those are just two real quick videos that I hope guys will find kind of cool.
Definitely. And what's the website for the book and your decals?
Yeah, hold on here just a second.
All right.
It's gonna be easier to do it this way. Sorry about my desktop being such a mess here. Give me a sec here. Okay, those are the two URLs.
Excellent. We'll just leave those up there as we close out tonight. We want to thank everybody for joining us. Thanks for hanging in there with us, and don't forget to click that like, subscribe, or follow button so we can let you know about future shows. As always, if you have ideas for a topic that you'd like to hear about, just send Leah Block an email at media@cafhq.org. Again, thank you, David, for sharing your insights on Operation Tidal Wave some 79 years later. Until next time, from the Commemorative Air Force, I'm Steve Boas. Have a great night.
Thanks, Steve. Bye-bye.